Good evening all and welcome. Tonight for you I have a collection of scary camping stories. So grab your tents and flashlights because it's time to get comfortable. Don't forget to check out my Patreon for free week over there if you would like to listen to some free, true, exclusive stories all week this week. Tonight I've got some pretty good haunted hospital stories. But for right now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. A friend and I were camping late in the fall. Around this time, it starts getting really cold. At the trail entrance, there was a weathered wooden sign that said to watch out for bobcats. Fair enough, we thought. We were out at the sticks after all. We hiked a few miles into our site and tried to get a fire going, but no luck. It had rained the night before and everything was soaked. Even the stuff we thought was dry was cold and useless. So at dusk, we strung up our hammocks and decided to just try and sleep. It was freezing. I had multiple layers on plus my jacket and still ended up wrapping myself in a space blanket. About an hour later, after a whole lot of tossing and shivering, I heard my buddy from his hammock say, "You cold?" I shouted back, freezing my nuts off. We tried the whole body heat thing, spooning like two pathetic human burritos, but that wasn't doing much either. Finally, we gave up. Around midnight, we packed up and started heading back to my car. The only light we had were our headlamps, barely cutting through the fog that had settled in. About halfway back, just as we're passing through a narrow trailhead lined with heavy brush, we spot eyes. They were low to the ground about a foot off the trail to the left. It was a pale green glow, staring straight at us. We froze. It was too close to ignore and too quiet to make sense. My first thought was obviously a bobcat, and then I asked myself why it wasn't moving. We decided to charge it. Stupid, we know, but we had no other option. Blew our bear whistles, screamed bloody murder, and tried to look big, loud, and threatening, but it didn't move. Not until we were within maybe 10 feet, and then it exploded out of the brush like it had been waiting. But it wasn't a bobcat. Not exactly. It was lean and fast, but longer than it should have been. Almost no fur on its back legs, just pale stretched skin and yellow eyes that didn't blink. And it lunged straight at me. I barely had time to react. I felt the teeth hit my boot and felt it go through it. I went down hard, kicking and flailing as it clamped onto my ankle. It didn't growl or snarl, it just bit and held on. My friend was swinging his pack at it, hitting it on the side, and after what felt like forever, maybe 10, 12 seconds, it let go and vanished into the woods. I couldn't feel my foot. The bite hadn't broken the skin deep, but it tore right through the leather of my boot and left welts the size of quarters. Had I been wearing trail runners or just skin socks, that thing would have taken my foot with it. We didn't stop running until we hit the parking lot. Later at the ER, the nurse said the spacing of the marks didn't match anything local. Maybe a really aggressive coyote, she offered, but she wasn't so sure. I had to get a full round of rabies shot, tetanus too, just in case. They don't mess around with unknown animal bites. 4 shots over 2 weeks? Not fun. But still, better than what might have happened had it clamped down harder. And whatever that thing was, it watched us from the brush and didn't fear us at all. This happened in 1994, when I was 6 years old. My family was camping up north at our usual spot in Canada, the same site we'd been going to for years. Everything had been totally normal until one evening the radio suddenly blasted out a weather alert. A major storm was coming. They warned everyone to take shelter immediately, saying it could even be a tornado, which, living in Canada, we didn't hear often. Tornadoes weren't really something we prepared for. We were more used to lightning storms, maybe the occasional flash flood. My dad looked out at the sky and said it would probably pass us by, so we stayed put. That decision still haunts me. Around 1 a.m. I woke up to chaos. My mum had picked me up, and I was carried down the campground road, panicked and rushing through the dark. Our car wouldn't start, and she was trying to get us to safety on foot. The storm was unreal. Once my eyes adjusted, all I could see was light. Lightning everywhere, branches crackling, metal clanging, wind howling so loud it was hard to hear each other speak. I haven't seen a storm that violent in 30 years. I remember hearing adults talk about being in the eye of the storm and realizing how scared they were, which made it even worse for me. When you're 6 and the grown-ups look terrified, that's when you know things are bad. We were trying to walk to a shelter about 15 minutes away, but the wind made it nearly impossible. With debris flying around us, the rain felt like needles. Then out of nowhere, this older couple opened their trailer door and shouted for us to get inside. They didn't even hesitate. They saw us out there and pulled us into safety. Looking back, I think about how dangerous it was for them to even open that door in the first place, but they did it anyway. Outside trailers were being flipped, people were yelling, trees were falling, and lightning was hitting everything around us. The whole park felt like it was coming apart. Ours wasn't one of the trailers that flipped, but a few near us were destroyed. We made it through the night, and no one in our family got hurt. But to this day, whenever I'm out camping and hear a storm warning, something inside me freezes up. I hold it together on the outside, but I'm 6 years old again on the inside, watching lightning rip the sky apart and feel the wind push us down that pitch black path. And I never forgot the couple that let us into their trailer without question. And I still think about how differently that night could have ended if it wasn't for their kindness. I was in New Mexico and stepped off the trail to take a leak. As soon as I started urinating, I heard that unmistakable rattle. I had started peeing on a rattlesnake I hadn't seen. It was green and blended in perfectly with the grass. I hadn't noticed a damn thing until it started shaking. I bolted midstream, started pissing myself while running like hell, made for a fun and slightly damp afternoon of walking. On another trip, I was sharing a tent with a buddy who had a habit of sleep talking. It was usually harmless and easy to ignore, but one night, deep in that dead silent hour when everything feels still, he sat up bolt upright and screamed loud, panicked, blood-curdling screams out of nowhere. It woke me up out of a dead sleep and scared the absolute hell out of me. I was frozen solid for a minute before I realized he was still asleep, and he didn't remember a thing in the morning. I was also up in Denali once, camping near one of those small one-room cabins that seasonal fishermen use. Inside was a logbook, and someone had written that a grizzly had been in camp just 2 days before. Try sleeping after reading something like that, especially when you start noticing signs of bear activity nearby. Some fading tracks, branches snapping in ways that didn't feel accidental. I've seen grizzlies from a distance, and that was close enough. They're massive animals with unpredictable tempers, and I have no interest in meeting one up close. Anytime you're in high country with bears, the night gets a little tense. You find yourself lying awake and wondering if you packed everything right. Did you forget something scented in a pocket? Did your gloves still smell like snacks? Does deodorant attract bears? Even knowing they'll likely spook if they don't have cubs. It's hard to stay calm when you hear something sniffing around your tent, or a bump against the fabric. Having a large animal pressing in against the side of your shelter in the middle of the night isn't what I call a good time. And then there are nights that just felt odd. But nothing can compare to the following story, by far the worst. I was exploring a new trail in a state I hardly had been to before. There were branching trails, and I chose one that looked relatively unused to see what I could find. There was the promise of a beautiful lake at the end, and it was a shortcut of sorts, and even though it had a bit of a steep hike, I chose to do it. I began the hike and was feeling really good. I hadn't seen anyone all day as I'd got here really early, and as I was walking, just in my element, listening to the sound of the trees being pushed by the wind, did I suddenly fall. If you've ever fallen completely unexpectedly, it really hits you hard. All of a sudden, I was in a puddle, and my back and my hands and my face, everything was caked in mud and water. My clothes were wet and I was feeling disgusting and in pain. I had hit my hands, my knees, and to some extent my head incredibly hard on the bottom of this hole. It had come out of nowhere. It looked like I was just following the path. If any of you have ever watched old television shows where the dastardly villains might make a hole for someone to fall in, cover it with weak sticks, mud and leaves and such to make it look like part of the path, well, I was walking on what I thought was just part of the path, and I was honestly looking ahead, not so much at the ground. And I obviously fell into this hole. Some knob had dug a hole intentionally to make someone fall in. I don't know how long it had been here, but I was in pain. The hole was easy enough to climb out of, but geez did it hurt. The pain was unforgiving. My knees, hands, and head were all bleeding, and I was feeling really unsettled. I climb out of the hole, mud everywhere, soaked to the skin because it had obviously rained since someone had made the hole, and a fair amount of water had filtered through it. I was so angry though. Who the hell would do this to someone they didn't know for no apparent reason? As I got out, my mind in a rage, I scoped the area and looked to see if I could see the person who'd done this, the person responsible for my fall, if there was a hidden camera or someone with their phone in hand ready to laugh at my expense. But as I peered out, I couldn't see a single person. I didn't look thoroughly enough to see if there was a hidden camera or anything, but I think maybe the person who did this didn't do it to capture it on video, but rather just for the thrill of knowing they were going to cause harm to someone they didn't know. I went home, cleaned myself up. Fortunately, everything was relatively superficial, but the trust I lost that day for hiking is something that stayed with me. You just never know, I guess. Maybe there would have been signs, maybe I should have been paying more attention to the ground, but truthfully, why would I need to do that? It just sickens me that people are like this. Before I get into this story, I want to echo what others have said. Humans are the most dangerous things you can run into in the wild. I started training to ride the entire Sawtooth Wilderness Traverse in 2011. It's a long stretch of alpine trail broken into segments, and I was determined to do the whole thing by bike. This was my first big bike packing attempt. I'd picked up a bunch of ultralight gear, spent time in free mountain bike maintenance clinics, and did a trial run on the same lower elevation trail segment, since it was one of the few that wasn't buried in snow in March. I've camped my whole life, mostly in Montana and parts of Idaho, so I try to play it safe when solo. I hang food and trash, cook away from my tent, clean up before sleeping, and carry bear mace and a fixed blade, air horn, even a bell on the frame bag. On my 5th or 6th trip up there, the weather was oddly warm for mid-March, and more trail opened up, so I was excited to push a bit deeper. I double-checked my gear, packed for temps in the teens just in case, and rode out from my place in Boise. One of the great things about where I lived is I could hit forest trails within 45 minutes of pedaling from my front door. Once I got past Dry Creek, everything was new terrain to me. The single track was clear, birds were out, it felt perfect. Then I came around a bend and saw a full suspension track leaned against a tree. Odd. About 100 yards past that, I started hearing the rhythmic sound of a handsaw. When I reached a clearing, there was a guy, mid-50s, flannel shirt and long hair, sawing a fallen tree across the trail. He was friendly. He said he'd been clearing up trails there every spring for decades, I helped him pull the cut sections out the way. We got talking and I probably shared too much. Told him I wasn't carrying a firearm and that I was new to the area and where I was camping. He seemed fine, genuinely into bikes and gear talk, and as we partied he told me about a nice sheltered spot about a half-mile ahead on the right. He said it had a great view of the canyon and a good campfiring. I was tired from the ride and hauling logs, so to me it sounded great. I followed his directions and found the spot exactly as described. He even mentioned some tools in a waxed canvas bag under a large rock ledge nearby. Sure enough, I found them: hatchet, saw, hammer, and I used the saw to prep some firewood. Had a good dehydrated meal, a bit of dessert, and chilled by the fire, smoked a bowl, and turned in. I'd gotten more used to sleeping alone at that point, even brought earplugs to block out the forest noise. But sometime deep in the night, something jolted me wide awake. I don't know what, just hair standing on end fear. I had earplugs in, so whatever woke me had to be significant. I grabbed my headlamp and looked outside, but there was nothing. No eye shine, no sound, not even wind. It was oddly warm but perfectly still. I got fully dressed, grabbed my bear mace and knife and stepped out. There was some odd feeling I couldn't quite put my finger on. I used my alarm ring, one of those 130 decibel screamers, and pulled the pin just in case. Perhaps it was nothing, but something had absolutely shattered my sleep and I couldn't ignore the gut feeling. After the alarm, I was hit with this overwhelming wave of dread, like my whole body froze. It wasn't rational, but it was primal. Something was very wrong. If I'd been car camping, I'd have thrown everything into the vehicle and peeled out. But I had to methodically pack all my gear and balance it in for the ride. Took me 15 minutes of absolute terror. I kept scanning the woods, heart pounding the whole time. I finally started to ride out. First a downhill stretch, then a mile and a half of brutal uphill single track. It was about 2 a.m., moonlight bright enough to see without issue. About halfway up the last hard climb before the overlook at Miner's Notch, I hear something, 4 feet to my right, just off the trail, walking heavy. I froze. I couldn't see anything in the thick trees, but I could hear it. I jumped off my bike and yelled, "Get out of here!" But it didn't faze it. I heard a shift, twigs breaking, still there, so I yelled out, over and over, pushing my bike uphill to regain momentum. I got back on the bike but had to stop and push a few more times. I was screaming into the dark like a maniac because I kept hearing footsteps pacing me. They were either human or animal, but I couldn't really tell. When I reached Miner's Notch, I stopped to catch my breath. I didn't even get off the bike, I just leaned on the trail sign. That's when I heard something barreling uphill behind me, for the same section I'd just climbed. It was fast, snapping branches and charging. Still unsure what it was, but knowing that it had been stalking me for over an hour, and it was coming right at me. From that spot it was over 7 miles of winding downhill single track back to the main road, and I launched. I was going so fast through those switchbacks, it was honestly dangerous. Cliffs and edges, tight turns, but I didn't care. I was moving like a pro racer, trying to put as much distance as I could between me and whatever this thing was. About halfway down I reached a boulder. I always dismount for these tricky rocky sections, and while walking the bike around it I paused. Up above me, crashing through the trees, something was cutting straight down the mountain, not using the trail at all, not bothering with the switchbacks, just barreling through. It was about 100 yards up and closing fast. I didn't wait. I got back on and bombed down the rest of the trail, heart going 1,000 beats a minute. I didn't stop until I was on pavement. I've never been so scared in my life. I still don't know what the hell was stalking me up there, but whatever it was big and wanted me the hell away from there, and I don't think it was just a curious animal. I was probably around 13 when this happened, out at a Boy Scout summer camp somewhere deep in the woods. One of the requirements for a badge, I think it was wilderness survival, meant we had to hike out to this remote area, build shelters out of sticks and leaves, and spend the night out there like little woodland soldiers. I remember thinking it was cool at first. The counselors led us through a winding trail that seemed to go on forever, and by the time we got there, I couldn't even hear the sounds of the main camp anymore. It really felt like we were in the middle of nowhere. We built our shelters, cooked over a fire, and someone told stories, normal camp stuff. It was fun. Then around 1 p.m, one of the counselors told us it was time to head to our shelters for the night. Some of us groaned, but we listened, and I remember lying down on the leaves and sticks that I'd piled together and thinking, okay, this isn't so bad. And then I heard it. Church bells. Not super loud, but clear enough to hear. A constant ding, ding, ding every 30 seconds or so. Faint, but there. At first, I thought I must be imagining it. Then I heard other kids talking about it. A few of us peeked out of our shelters and looked towards the counselors, who were sitting by the fire. They looked concerned, not panicked, but definitely not relaxed either. The bells went on for maybe half an hour, and then they stopped. And something else started. Singing. It was distant at first, like when your neighbor has music playing through the walls and you can't quite catch the words, but it was definitely a lot of people singing. It sounded like a church choir, but not a normal one. It was louder, happier. The weirdest part, sometimes it felt like it was getting closer, like the voices were moving and surrounding us, and then it would fade again, barely audible, then rise up, loud enough that it felt like it was right there in the woods with us. I was terrified, we all were. I remember crawling out of my shelter and whispering to one of the counselors, and he looked at me with this forced calm smile and said, "Don't worry, there's just a church service going on back at camp." A midnight church service with bells and loud singing in the middle of the woods? No one believed him, but we didn't know what else to do. The singing went on for what felt like forever. Definitely past midnight until maybe 1 a.m, then it just stopped. I didn't sleep at all that night. A few days later, we found out what it really was. There had been a large KKK rally just a few miles up from camp that night. So yeah, not a church service. I've done a lot of camping over the years. Hundreds of nights under the stars, miles of trail, all kinds of terrain. Some trips were peaceful. Some I'll never forget, for entirely different reasons. There is something that I would like to share. I was hiking into a backwoods campsite alone. It was mid-afternoon on a quiet trail with a heavy canopy. I hadn't seen anyone in hours when I rounded a bend and saw a guy just standing off the trail. He had an axe in his hand. Now that's not unusual in the woods. I carried one myself. But this guy wasn't carrying it usually. He was gripping it low, like he was ready to swing. "Hey there," I say, like I always do on the trail. He just stared. His face wasn't angry, but it was definitely off. I passed him without incident, but I could feel his cold stare on my back until I was well out of sight, and I never heard him walk away. Another time, I was late in my teens camping with a group of 10 friends in the middle of nowhere with no cell service. We hiked in deep, found a flat patch near a stream and set up camp. That night we got wasted, and the next morning most of our food was gone. Our pack was completely missing. We thought raccoons, but then we saw puncture marks too big for raccoons. Rangers we flagged down later told us a tagged bear known to locals as Sasha had been active nearby with her cubs. None of us woke up. 10 people asleep in tents, and another bear walked through camp and took her time raiding our food and left. If she'd poked her head into one of those tents instead, we would have been human burritos ready for eating. One other occasion, I was leading a canoe group on a multi-day trip, late thaw that year. The river was swollen and fast-moving, and incredibly cold. We came upon a bridge with only a foot of clearance, so we had to lie flat in the canoes and back-paddle to ease ourselves under. It was tight and we barely made it. On the other side, there was a group waving at us from the bank, yelling that we should have our life jackets on. Then someone called out, "We're looking for a body." Another group had come through an hour before. One canoe tipped under the same bridge and someone didn't come back up. Later I found my parents had heard about the accident on the news. They thought it might have been me or one of my friends. Someone was even sent out to check. It wasn't us, but we passed over the same water, the same stretch of current minutes later. You've got to remember that it doesn't take much to fall out of the world out there. This happened when I was 11 years old. My mum took me camping at a regular old public campground. Not anything super remote, but wooded enough that we felt like we were away from the world for a bit. One afternoon, we decided to take a walk down to the river. On our way, we passed another campsite where there had been an older man earlier in the day. I remembered him because he had this huge, shepherd-type dog and seemed like the kind of guy who camped a lot. But this time something didn't seem right. The driver's side door of his truck was hanging wide open, and the dog was just sitting there, not moving, nor barking, nor wagging, just still. It was parked nose out, and the dog was sitting by the front bumper staring into the trees. My mum and I both noticed it. I think she slowed down a little. I remember feeling that weird, low-in-your-gut unease, even if I didn't know why. But we didn't hear anything. I didn't see the man, so we just kept walking. We hung out by the river for a while. When we came back the same way, everything was exactly the same. The truck door is still open, the dog is still sitting in the exact same spot, not reacting at all, like he hadn't moved a muscle. We didn't say much, just gave the dog a glance and walked on to our site. It wasn't until later that evening we saw a couple of sheriff's trucks roll slowly into the campground. Then came the whispers from nearby campsites. They found a dead guy by his truck. The dog was just sitting next to him. It was the man we passed. He must have died sometime that day next to his truck, just barely out of sight. We must have walked past his body twice and never seen him, and his dog never left his side. Even now, years later, that image still sticks with me more than anything. The open truck door, the completely still dog, and that weird feeling that something was wrong, even though I wasn't entirely sure what it was. A few years ago, I was doing a solo 10-day backpacking trip in Utah, in a remote section of the Boulder Mountains, right near the edge of the Grand Staircase. Rugged alpine terrain, jagged ridgelines, steep pine-covered slopes. This wasn't beginner country. There was no cell service and no day hikers, and no chance of a quick rescue if something went wrong. You really are on your own out there. So one night, I hiked about 22 miles into the range. I made camp near a rocky outcrop surrounded by old-growth pine and deadfall, with no sign of other humans. Just mule deer tracks and the occasional bear scat. I set up my tent and passed out after dinner thinking nothing of it. But at midnight, I woke up to a scratching noise outside my tent right near my head. It was slow, like fingernails on the tent wall. Groggily and disoriented, I sat up and asked, "Are you big or small?" But I didn't hear a thing in reply. I held my breath and listened as hard as I could. Then 15 seconds later, I heard footsteps circling the tent. I asked out loud this time, "Is someone messing with me?" But still received no reply. So I reached for my phone, unlocked the screen, and turned on the camera to start recording. I still have the video. Black footage with the sound of me whispering in the dark, breathing heavy and straining to hear something. I was scared witless. My thoughts ran wild. Was it a bear, a mountain lion, or a person? I'm honestly 90% sure it was a person. What's terrifying is how easy it would have been to kill me. I was completely alone, 22 miles from the trailhead and deep in alpine terrain with no signal, no backup, and no one expecting to hear from me for days. If someone had wanted to mess with me, or worse, they could have done it. and no one would have known who or why. For 4 hours, I listened to it circle the tent, sometimes stopping for long stretches then moving again. It never made a sound above a whisper. Not a single twig snapped, not a single pine cone crunched. And there were hundreds of them all over the ground. It eventually ran off before dawn with fast long strides, way too heavy to be a deer. When the sun came up, I unzipped the tent and stepped out, my legs trembling. I scanned the area. No sign of animal prints, just human shoe prints. They circled the tent twice, then veered off into the brush. And those damn pine cones, not a single one disturbed. Whoever it was had incredible control over their movements. Night vision perhaps, or military experience, but I can't say for sure. I told a ranger about it when I got back and he brushed it off, saying it was a bear or cougar. But no, it wasn't. This wasn't random sniffing or territorial behavior. This was someone deliberately moving around my tent without being seen or heard in the pitch dark. And here's the part that sticks with me. Right before I entered the range, as I was organizing my pack at the trailhead, an older couple in their mid-60s approached. The man was tall and in incredible shape for his age, lean, sun worn and alert. They asked casually, "You heading in alone?" I hesitated and said I was. The man smiled and said, "Brave, be safe up there." They stood there for a while watching me ascend into the basin, and I never saw them again. I don't know if it was him, I'll never be able to prove it obviously. If someone followed me that far in then spent the night circling my tent just to mess with me, or test how vulnerable I was, that's more frightening than a mountain lion or bear. The rest of the trip thankfully was totally uneventful, not a single noise at night, no more tracks. Just the joy of hiking. But that first night made me realize how invisible you become out there. I've backpacked all over the US since then, and I've got other stories, but none of them made me feel quite as exposed or watched as that one. My name is Nolan. I'm 24 now, but when this happened I was only 12. I live not far from Paris, but I loved traveling and have done since I was a kid. For 5 summers straight, from 09 to 13, my mum signed me up for summer camps every July. These camps were amazing. I travelled all over France, camping, hiking, mountaining, doing caves, ropes, so many fun activities, and since I was young I loved each minute of it. Then came 2013, which turned out to be the worst year of my life, and the last time I ever went to camp. That camp was on Ile d'Oléron, an island in western France connected to the mainland by a large bridge. The island is known for being really hot in summer, having amazing food, nice beaches, and an especially famous monument called Fort Boyard, an old prison in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean that once held criminals. The camp was set in the middle of nature. Imagine a small group of buildings arranged into an L shape. On one side was the entrance, and on the other was thick bushes leading into a forest. The buildings were divided between the kids' dorms, laundry rooms, the dining hall, and the instructors' dorms. At that time in my life, I was pretty rebellious and didn't like to listen. 2 of my friends, Malik and Enzo, came with me, so we weren't all set for a crazy time. Everything was fine during the first 6 days of camp, and we had so much fun. But on the 7th day, things started going wrong, mostly because of us. That night we had campfire game session, playing board games like Uno from 8 PM to 1 PM, and after that, the instructors announced lights out, and everyone went to their rooms. Malik, Enzo and I shared a room, so we brushed our teeth and went to bed. About half hour later, the instructors turned off all the lights. Around midnight, I came up with a terrible idea. A night walk in the forest with my 2 friends, even though we were only 12 and 13. We opened our window, looked around quickly, and saw that none of the instructors were awake. They were all asleep. probably too tired after the day's activities. We quietly crossed the camp courtyard, sneaking past the building, and entered the bushes on the far side of the site. We walked about 10 to 15 minutes into the forest. While walking, I was joking around and trying to scare my friends with creepy stories. Suddenly, we arrived at the fence of an old abandoned house. The house looked really run down and creepy, like something out of a witch story. Being young and dumb, we decided to go into the garden, and to our surprise, the gate was open, so we stepped inside. As soon as we started walking into the garden, we heard a huge, loud scream coming from a man with a deep, scary voice. We were so scared that at first we couldn't even understand what he was yelling. Then the front door of the house under the porch opened, and we saw a man running towards us. We panicked, nearly crying, and instantly reopened the gate behind us. We ran as fast as we could back towards the camp. We managed to get back and woke everyone up in the middle of the night, so stressed, scared, and panicked that I was crying a lot. The instructors obviously scolded us for being so reckless and dangerous, but it was clear from our faces we weren't making it up. We told them what happened and finally went back to our rooms. I couldn't sleep that night, and I kept replaying the scene in my head. But one detail stuck with me thanks to the moonlight. The man limped and had a wooden leg, but even so he ran really fast. I don't know why, but I had a very bad feeling about the whole thing. I wish that had been the end of this story, but no. On the 9th day, the last day of camp, we were outside doing various activities when the instructor asked if we had our swimsuits ready, because we were going to the pool. I said no, and that I needed to get mine from my room, so I ran alone to the dormitory about 10 meters away. I opened the door, then closed it behind me, without turning on the light. Inside the room, since we had the shutters closed, it was almost completely dark, but some little holes let in a bit of moonlight. At that moment, about 5 meters from me, I saw a tall, human-like figure standing still. I couldn't see its face, just the silhouette. I didn't understand what was happening, but I was frozen and couldn't move. What felt like an eternity, probably just 5 or 6 seconds later, I suddenly turned, opened the door, and ran outside screaming that someone was in my room. I ran crying towards the center of the camp where everyone was. An instructor immediately went with some colleagues to check out my room, but it was empty. Suddenly the instructors called everyone to come to my room because they found something terrifying. On the floor was a piece of paper with the words, "I will return tonight," written on it. I froze and cried twice as much as before. That night, the instructors stayed in pairs outside every door so no one could enter any rooms. Thankfully, no one came back to my room that night. We left camp the next day, but because of those incidents, I never went back to camp after I was 13. It took me a long time to want to travel again with friends or family to places I didn't know. It wasn't until I was 19 that I dared go on vacation again. When I told my mum about what happened, she told me I was incredibly stupid and brave at the same time, and that I did the right thing because whoever was in my dorm that night obviously didn't mean well, especially with the note left behind. But honestly, going into the forest was so freaking stupid. Like, I don't even know why I did that. Even 12 years later, the question still haunts me. What was that person doing in my room? Was it the same man who chased us in the forest? What did he want? And how did he find my room? These questions keep me awake many nights, and I've had plenty of nightmares because of them. Like I said at the start, even if I mostly laugh about it now, sometimes I still get anxious over the smallest things. A few years back, my now ex-girlfriend and I were camping near the summit of Pineback Ridge, not far from a mountain town known for its breweries and hiking trails. When we checked into the campground, the ranger gave us the usual rundown, rules, trail updates, and a few very specific warnings about bears in the area. I actually listened, which turned out to be very important. First night, no problem. We set up camp, then decided to head back down into town for dinner and a few beers. The second night, we stayed in, made a fire, cooked at camp, and after we ate, I cleaned everything up like the ranger said, food locked in the trunk, cookware placed away, and trash in the bear-proof bins. I felt like I'd done everything right. We crash sometime around 11, exhausted. So it's the middle of the night, when we hear something moving around outside. I'm half awake and assume it's raccoons or some possums sniffing the fire pit. I roll over, she nudges me and says, "Do you hear that?" I mumble something like, "Yeah, it's just an animal, no big deal." She tells me to be quiet, but I remember the ranger specifically saying to make noise if you think a bear is nearby. Let it know you're human and awake. So I start shouting loudly, "Who's out there? You lost, buddy." She hisses to be quiet. I'm like, this is literally what the ranger told us to do. And eventually whatever was out there wandered off and we went back to sleep. Nothing got torn up, no growls, so it all seemed fine. The next morning we pack up to hit the road. About 20 minutes into the drive, she suddenly leans forward, squinting at the passenger side window and says, "What the hell was that?" "What?" I ask. "There was a footprint on your window. Did you have some other girl in the car last night?" I'm completely thrown off. I tell her no, and I have no idea what she's talking about. But she angles herself towards the sun, and that's when I see it clear as day. A massive, bare paw print smeared across the glass. It must have stood up next to the car in the middle of the night, and put its paw right there, inches from where we were sleeping. We both went silent for a moment, then burst out laughing. It was hilarious and terrifying to realize how close that bear had actually come. If I hadn't followed those instructions and cleaned up, who knows how differently that night could have gone. And, for the record, I never did cheat on her, unless you count flirting with death. For context, I am female, and was 20 at the time this happened. It was the summer of 2020, and I had gone on a trip to Moab, Utah with my roommate and best friend since high school, Kendall, who was 21 at the time. We had last minute joined her family trip, celebrating her sister's high school graduation. We lived a few hours by car from Moab, which had just reopened after being closed to the public due to COVID. They had plans to go skydiving, and we were excited to tag along. Our plan was to drive separately, stay the night on the couch of her family's Airbnb, go skydiving with them, and then stay the night at a small cabin in the campground right outside of town, where just the two of us would go as an added adventure. We had never been on a trip as adults, staying on our own, and were excited to have some independence. Fast forward. We had a great trip down there, as well as a fun first night with Kendall's family. We all went skydiving in the early morning. It was beautiful. After that, Kendall and I had a huge adrenaline rush and decided to go for a hike to a watering hole. There we explored and even did a small cliff jump into the water. By the end of the day, we were exhausted physically from our activities and from the rush and now drop of adrenaline. We had checked into our campground, which is about 10 miles from the town. There was a general store at the mouth of the property, with somewhat unfriendly older cashiers to check us in. But we didn't think much of it. The campground was made for different sections of the tents, RVs and small cabins. When I say small cabins, I mean room for 2 twin beds and a chair and hardly anything else. And we stayed in one of those. Like I said, Moab had just reopened to tourists, so besides us, we saw one other family of 3 staying in the entire campground. We also noticed we didn't have cell phone signal in the camp. Remember that. By nightfall, we could hardly move our bodies. We were so sore and spent. About an hour in camp chairs under the stars, drinking a few Mike's Hards. And before I knew it, I realized we'd had a little too much for being in an unfamiliar place on our own, but shook it off. We decided to call it a night and grabbed our lantern and headed to the communal bathrooms to wash our faces. Also, I'll add now that Kendall had sprained her ankle a month prior to this and was wearing a boot on her right leg. Yes, she went skydiving and hiking with this. We were young and eager to get out after lockdown, but she was unable to drive with the angle her foot needed to be able to brake safely, so I had been doing all the driving. We made our way to the bathroom, giggling through the pitch dark with our light. We reached the hut that held the 4 separated bathrooms. Each had a shower directly across from the door, and a toilet and a sink against the side wall. We swung the door down, eager to get out of the dark, and flipped on the light switch. I entered the room first and immediately stopped in my tracks. Kendall stopped in the doorway, and we both were silent. There was something off. I don't know how to describe it, but it was like an intense feeling that something was wrong. We stared forwards at the shower, which had the curtain half drawn closed. There was some kind of short stepping stool in the middle of the curtain, with the front 2 legs poking out from behind the curtain. My eyes started to raise, as I could make out the faint silhouette of a person standing on the stool behind the thin curtain. We stood there frozen in shock, disbelief, and confusion. There couldn't be someone hiding behind the curtain like in a scary movie, could there? Suddenly, Kendall broke the silence. "What's that?" I looked to my right where the sink was, and propped on the sink against the mirror was an iPhone with the screen facing us. The camera was out and recording. That snapped me out of my tracks. Nope. We both turned around and ran back to our cabin. We locked the door and tried to figure out what we just walked into. We couldn't call anyone because we had no signal, and this was our first time staying somewhere new on our own. I had been drinking and didn't feel confident that I could drive through the rocks and sharp turns to make it back to the highway. We tried to calm ourselves down, talk our way out of what we saw. We turned the lights off because I couldn't get the image of someone looking through the small 1 window on the door leading to our cabin. We were all alone in this campground, completely exhausted physically from our skydive and our hike. I know it sounds dumb, but at the time we were so confused and tired, we decided to just go to sleep and leave first thing. We pushed our beds together and lay there in the dark and silence, and I started to think about the staff who worked at the campground, and if they knew it was almost empty. Had they been the one in the bathroom? Or were we mistaken in what we saw? About 10 minutes into laying there, Kendall said, "You know what's weird?" I froze, waiting to hear something to add to this horrible situation. She told me about earlier when she'd gone to take a shower, how she'd looked up and saw a blinking blue light in the vent above the shower. I didn't say anything, and we left in the morning and never spoke of it again. Honestly, I know we didn't handle the situation well, but please don't roast me in the comments. If it had happened now, there was no way we wouldn't have reported it, but we were young and afraid. We didn't know how to process what was happening. I still don't really know what happened. Anyway, we never stayed there again. During college, that was located away from major cities, the woods were all around us. That being said, there was a highly rated trail, the Loyal Sock Trail, which was about an hour drive from the university. I invited a friend to come with me as he'd never been on an extended backpacking trip, a 50-plus mile trail that we intended to backpack over the 4-day weekend. I'm an Eagle Scout who has spent countless hours in the woods and went on backpacking trips constantly throughout my college experience. As many have said before me, you get used to the minor spooky things happening, coyote howls, raccoons in the middle of the night, even the occasional unknown noise. The scariest thing to find in the woods, however, are people. We were about 20 miles into the trail, and being Pennsylvania, where the underbrush and tree line are pretty dense, I always walk about 100 meters off the trail to reduce the chances of me disturbing people, or people disturbing me, especially in the early morning when I choose to sleep. Following that same strategy, my friend and I went out of our way to be in this amazing spot, a good ways off the trail where it would be even difficult to see our flashlights from it. The spot was out on a peninsula where a creek met a river, meaning there was only one way into our camp, and only one way out. We start a fire, cook our food, and drink, but not enough to get drunk. We put the fire out about midnight and head into our individual tents, and all is fine. It's the fall semester, so leaves are on the ground, the moon is bright, shining through the bare trees, and the air is cool. The only noise is the occasional time I would hear my friend turn over in his sleep. And then I hear the voices. The voices sounded very close for being on the trail 100+ meters away. It's 3 a.m. Who hikes at 3 a.m.? We're 20 miles in. I slowly get out of my sleeping bag, unzip my tent, only to see my friend peeking out of his tent in the exact same fashion. He quickly moves his finger over his mouth in an exaggerated hush signal, and then uses the same hand to frantically motion towards the way of the trail. Then we see them, 4 adults, 3 men and 1 woman, walking directly towards our camp. No lights illuminate their path. They are walking silently at this point. Only one of them has a backpack, an impossibility for the long hike. They were only 1/3 of the way through. Being a long trip, you bring wood-cutting supplies to chop branches into smaller branches to burn. For me, this was a survival knife. Grabbing the knife, believing it's the only way of defending myself, I am even more disheveled than I've ever been, especially knowing that a knife is barely defense at all. These people walk to our site, sit down by our extinguished fire pit, and sit there for what felt like an eternity. My friend speaks up and asks what they're doing at our campsite. Without answering the question, they ask if we have any food. Having packed as lightly as possible for the long trip, we only have a few extra Mountain House MRE-style meals. I grab one out the bag and toss it to the man. In rapid succession, I ask why they aren't using light, and if they need help finding the trail, and why they're hiking so late. They respond saying they don't use light, they know where the trail is, and that it's better to hike at night. Unnerved at this point, my friend asks them to leave. They respond by asking if we want to light the fire and hang for a bit, but we do not. They grab their bag, get up, and leave without another word. We watch them leave and take shifts, making sure they don't return. Needless to say, we both got very little sleep that night. When the sun rose the next morning, we finally got real sleep, and by the afternoon when we woke up, it all felt like a strange dream. The only evidence was the fuzzy cap that they must have dropped, that I have to this day. I've never had something as weird as that happen in the woods before, and hope to never have it happen again. In the 8 years since that trip, I haven't been back to the Loyalsock Trail. This happened years ago, but pops into my head a lot. It was March/April of 2019. I'd just moved into Washington in October and made a friend who was stationed at JBLM, also not native to the state. He and I had been working on making the back of his pickup something we could camp in, and thought on a whim around midnight it would be fun to maybe go to the national park for a night. We make the drive out there. I note it's kind of weird and that the road is lined with residential homes, and at some point the road turns to dirt, and I guess we're in the park. This was a month or 2 after Snowmageddon, and the parks were out of season, so the road was pretty rough, but we made it through. Not being from there, I had an eerie feeling off the bat. I think they're Douglas trees. They were bald except from the very top from the heavy snow. Don't know what it is. They just feel unnatural and foreboding to me even all these years later. Initially, we pulled off into a little hill facing some tall grass that had a board for arrow practice. We hung out here for maybe 15 or 20 minutes, probably just creeped out from the trees. Honestly, I tell him I don't want to stay in that spot because there's only a narrow path to drive in and out of, and I don't love the idea of getting blocked in there. He says alright, we pull out and head down the road for a few minutes until we find a proper parking area at a camping trailhead. We were using a portable battery we'd gotten for the first time, and it made this sound when he turned it on. So he was outside away from the truck messing with it, and I'm trying to relax in the back, but just couldn't shake this strange feeling. There wasn't a way to go directly from the bed to the cabin, and this being the first time we weren't just out on the side of the road, I was a little anxious. So I stand outside for a minute, just looking around and listening. I think I was more trying to hear for bears, since those were a new thing for me to have to worry about, but instead I heard tires. I told my buddy to stop and listened, and then I saw lights in the distance, and we both threw the back shut and hopped in to leave. As we're driving out, the lights are at the top of the hill, and I tell him to slow down, thinking it was probably some park official out to make sure we're not causing trouble and tell us to skedaddle. He rolls down the window as they pass. I look and the truck isn't marked. There are two men at the front, not park officials, who make direct eye contact with us and don't slow. The second I see their faces, I tell my friend to absolutely gun it. The truck continued towards the parking lot, and I felt a bit of relief until I noticed they had turned around and were now catching up to us. We're probably going about 50 down some pretty rugged roads, and they're directly behind us within a few minutes. Once we make it back to the residential street, which might have only been 1 or 2 turns from where we were, but thank God my friend was able to remember the way back, we hit 60 to 70. They have not backed up at the time, and now have their brights on. I remember while looking out the window at the mirror, noticing a house's porch lights flick on. I spun around to watch out of the back, and someone was beginning to step out. Finally, though, I glanced over at the time, and it was around 3 a.m. The people at the house were probably unrelated, but still weird. But realizing the time exaggerated how insane it was, the people were chasing us. We get past the stop sign and obviously don't even slow down as we pull onto the main road. At that point, the truck then overtakes and passes us, must have been going at least 100, and turns down a side road. Now I'm pissed. I tell my buddy there's no way in hell. Let's go get him. Turn down the same road 15 to 20 seconds later and they're gone. There was a dead-end neighborhood street to the left that they couldn't have been in, a gas station a minute or two up the road that they weren't at, and then the interstate. How they made it all that way in such a short amount of time is beyond me. But the only explanation save for going down the first side street, parking in a driveway and shutting off their car immediately, could have been behind the gas station, but in either scenario, why were they now the ones hiding? After the fact, I looked up the park because what the hell even was that? We found out we did not go to Olympic National Park, but instead were in Capital State Forest, where the only weird thing I could really find was a body found in a burnt-out truck back in 2012. There's only a single article about it, so I have no idea if they ever figured that one out. Everything else was various accounts of people being shot or being found shot, but with there being gun activity allowed in a park, I don't find that surprising. More than likely it was some people living on that street that noticed us going out there in the middle of the night, and figured we were up to something and thought to freak us out. At least, that's all I hope so. I can't really imagine what would have happened if they'd have gotten to the parking lot while we were unprepared, or worse, if we were still in the original spot on the hill. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I do hope that you enjoyed tonight's collection of scary stories, and if of course you did, you can let me know down below. And if you've made it to the end, I want to remind you that over on Patreon we have Free Week, a special treat for the Halloween season. Free extra content every day this week. Well, weekdays, not weekends. Tonight I've got a really cool selection of haunted hospital stories. I recorded them just before recording this and I really like them, and I hope you like them too. And if you want to listen to them for free, just follow the link in the description to Patreon and you can check it out. I'd like to extend one final thank you to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen, and if you'd like to join their ranks, you could consider joining them by following the links as aforementioned. But I'm going to wrap it up here, guys. Thank you all so much for listening. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.